grand, bloody story of the Boer War, the fight for Mafeking should have been a sideshow. It was a tiny, dust-choked town with little strategic value, defended by a skeleton force. So why, for 217 agonizing days, did the entire world hold its breath, watching this one spot on the map? This is the story of how a small, forgotten garrison, through sheer grit and a touch of theatrical genius, became the most famous siege on Earth. It's a tale that gave the world a new word for endurance and inspired a global youth movement. This is the story of the Siege of Mafeking. To understand Mafeking, you have to understand the firestorm that was about to hit South Africa. The year is 1899, and the southern tip of the continent is a powder keg. On one side, you have the British Empire, the global superpower, a colossal machine of industry and military might. On the other, two small, fiercely independent Boer republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. The Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers who had trekked inland to escape British rule, were a rugged, devout people, deeply tied to their independence. They watched the British with a suspicion that had hardened over years. But then, deep beneath the dusty veldt of the Transvaal, something glittered. Gold. The discovery of the world's largest gold deposits in 1886 changed everything. It turned the quiet Boer Republic into the source of a quarter of the world's gold. And where there's gold, foreigners or Uitlanders soon follow. The vast majority of these newcomers were British, and their presence became a massive political crisis. The Boer government, led by the stern President Paul Kruger, denied the Uitlanders voting rights, terrified they would lose their hard-won independence at the ballot box. For arch-imperialists in London and Cape Town, this was both an intolerable situation and a golden opportunity. They saw the Boer republics as an obstacle to their dream of a British-controlled Africa, from Cairo to the Cape. The plight of the Uitlanders was the perfect excuse to intervene. Tensions boiled over in the disastrous Jameson Raid of 1896, a failed British-backed coup, and just kept escalating. By the autumn of 1899, diplomacy was dead. Kruger, seeing British troops massing on his borders, issued an ultimatum on October 9th. Withdraw your forces in 48 hours, or we're at war. The British Empire didn't do ultimatums. On October 11th, 1899, the Second Boer War began. The Boers struck first. Their citizen soldiers, the commandos, poured across the borders. Their strategy was simple: seize key towns, score quick victories, and force the British to the negotiating table before the full weight of the empire could crush them. 3 railway towns became their primary targets: Ladysmith, Kimberley, and a small, seemingly insignificant outpost called Mafeking. So what was Mafeking? Today, it's Mahikeng, a provincial capital, but in 1899, it was little more than a cluster of adobe buildings and tin-roofed houses around a market square, sitting on an open plain with no natural defenses. Still, its location was critical. It was a key administrative center, and more importantly, a vital junction on the new railway stretching from Cape Town to Rhodesia. Control Mafeking, and you control the main artery for British movement into the north. Lose it, and the Boers could wreak havoc. Months before the war, British High Command had chosen one of their most unconventional and charismatic colonels to raise a force and create a diversion on the Transvaal's western border. Robert Baden-Powell. Baden-Powell wasn't your typical Victorian officer. He was a showman, a master of psychological operations, and a skilled scout with a theatrical flair for leadership. His orders were to raise 2 regiments and conduct a mobile campaign. But Baden-Powell, perhaps sensing the coming storm, made a fateful decision. Instead of preparing for a war of movement, he chose to fortify a fixed position. He chose Mafeking. He secretly began stockpiling supplies, much to the annoyance of local politicians who feared he was provoking the Boers. When the siege began, his garrison was a motley crew of about 1,200 to 1,500 fighting men. This included about 500 from the Protectorate Regiment, 300 from the Bechuanaland Rifles and Cape Police, and another 300 town volunteers. Crucially, his force also included hundreds of armed African auxiliaries, primarily from the local Baralong tribe, whose pivotal role would be tragically overlooked in the triumphant stories that followed. Against this cobbled-together force, the Boers were about to unleash an army. On October 13, 1899, the hammer fell. Telegraph and railway lines were cut. Mafeking was alone. The man leading the Boer forces was one of their most formidable commanders, General Piet Cronje, a hard, unyielding veteran of the First Boer War. He arrived outside Mafeking with a force of around 5,000 to 6,000 men and several modern artillery pieces that were far superior to anything Baden-Powell had. Baden-Powell politely refused Cronje's demand for immediate surrender. The siege began with the methodical constriction of a python. Boer commandos established their camps, or lagers, and dug in, creating a ring of steel around the town's 6-mile perimeter. On October 16th, after his 9 a.m. deadline was ignored, Cronje ordered the first shells to be fired into the town. The psychological pressure was immense. The defenders were outnumbered at least 5-1. They were on an open plain with no natural cover and no modern artillery. The world expected Mafeking to fall in days, a swift overture to a war the British thought would be over by Christmas. But the Boers and the world had underestimated the man in command. They had underestimated his genius for bluff and his talent for turning a desperate defense into the greatest show on earth. Facing an overwhelming enemy, Baden-Powell knew he couldn't win a conventional fight. So he decided to play a different game, a game of smoke and mirrors. He would convince General Cronje that Mafeking was a fortress of terrifying strength. His first and most famous deception was creating entirely fictional minefields. Knowing Boer scouts were watching, he had his men bury boxes filled with sand and put up conspicuous signs warning of landmines. To really sell it, his own troops were ordered to theatrically avoid non-existent barbed wire fences. To complete the illusion, Baden-Powell would occasionally detonate a stick of dynamite in a remote area, as if testing his deadly new weapons. The ruse worked perfectly. The Boers, wary of the threat, never mounted a major frontal assault across the open ground where they believed hundreds of mines lay waiting. Baden-Powell's theater of war didn't stop there. He had a searchlight improvised from a biscuit tin and an acetylene lamp, which was moved each night to create the illusion of multiple, powerful searchlights. His few cannons were constantly repositioned to make the Boers believe the town was bristling with artillery. He also took the fight to the enemy, launching small, aggressive raids on the Boer lines to keep them on their toes. In one of his most daring moves, he had a train car armored at the local railway workshop, loaded it with sharpshooters, and sent it steaming into a Boer camp before safely returning. But this aggression had its risks. On December 26th, Baden-Powell launched a costly and failed attack on a Boer strongpoint known as Game Tree Fort. The attack was repulsed with significant casualties, a grim reminder of the real danger that lay beyond the bluffs. Still, the overall psychological impact of his strategy was profound. Piet Cronje was confounded. In November 1899, frustrated and believing Mafeking was contained, he took the bulk of his force south to counter a larger British relief effort. He left about 1,500 Boers under the command of the more passive General J.P. Snyman to maintain the siege. Baden-Powell's grand deception had succeeded. He had neutralized a much larger enemy force, but now the real enemy wasn't the Boer guns. It was the creeping specter of starvation. For 217 days, Mafeking was a world unto itself. As the initial excitement gave way to the monotonous reality of daily shelling, life became a grueling test of endurance. An extensive network of trenches and over 800 bomb-proof shelters were constructed. Yet, in a remarkable display of stiff upper lip resilience, the white population refused to let the war completely dominate their lives. Baden-Powell, the ultimate showman, understood the importance of morale. He negotiated Sunday truces with the Boers, allowing for a day of peace for sports, concerts, and theatricals. Cricket matches were played, and a sort of officer-class social life continued. The hub for the elite was the shelter of Lady Sarah Wilson, an aunt of Winston Churchill, and one of the first female war correspondents, who had been captured by the Boers and exchanged for a horse thief. But beneath this veneer of cheerful defiance, a much grimmer reality was setting in. Food became the great obsession. As supplies dwindled, the diet became grim. The garrison's cherished horses were slaughtered for meat, and their oats were ground into a coarse flour for bread. When the livestock was gone, the townspeople began to eat stray dogs. And here, the story splits into two starkly different narratives. While the white inhabitants endured hardship, the town's roughly 7,500 black residents, including the local Baralong people and refugees, faced outright starvation. Baden-Powell's policy was ruthless. The white garrison and civilians would be fed first. He systematically withheld rations from the native Stadt, the township where the Baralong lived, forcing them to fend for themselves. The suffering was immense. Desperate men, women, and children ate dogs, cats, and even the leather from their shoes. Many were shot trying to slip through Boer lines to forage for roots. Official records state that at least 478 Africans died of starvation, though the true number is believed to be over 1,000. It's a dark stain on the heroic narrative of Mafeking. The very people who helped dig the town's defenses were left to die to preserve food for the European population. For the white citizens, it was a siege of endurance. For many of the black Africans, it was a death sentence. The story of Mafeking is one of incredible complexity, filled with heroism, ingenuity, and profound moral compromises. If you're finding this deep dive into one of history's most famous sieges compelling, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more military history documentaries. We go beyond the headlines to explore the full story, and your support makes that possible. Now back to the story of a town on the brink. Day after day, the soundtrack of Mafeking was the whistle and crash of artillery. The Boers, under General Snyman, settled into a routine of long-range bombardment. Their most formidable weapon was a 94-pounder siege gun, nicknamed Creaky by the British, which hurled massive shells into the small town. Every time it fired, lookouts would sound an alarm, giving civilians a few precious seconds to dive into their shelters. The physical damage was extensive, but the primary impact was psychological. It was a war of nerves designed to grind down the defender's will to resist. Baden-Powell's response was an active defense. His sharpshooters manned the trenches, engaging in long-range duels with Boer riflemen. Skirmishes in the no-man's land were common, For the most part, however, the military situation was a stalemate. The Boers were unwilling to risk a costly assault, and Baden-Powell lacked the numbers to break out. As the siege dragged into 1900, a sense of weary resolve set in. Food was scarcer, disease was a constant threat, and the hope of relief felt like a distant dream. An attempt by a small Rhodesian force to fight its way in on March 31st was repelled, dealing a heavy blow to morale. The world was watching, but inside Mafeking, the defenders were beginning to wonder if they had been forgotten. Necessity is the mother of invention, and in Mafeking, it gave birth to astonishing improvisations. The town's railway workshop became a makeshift armory. Its most remarkable creation was a homemade cannon, nicknamed the Wolf. They even pressed an ancient muzzle-loading naval gun, which had been a gatepost for 20 years, back into service as Lord Nelson. When artillery shells ran low, the workshop began manufacturing new ones, along with homemade grenades packed in tin cans. But perhaps the most lasting innovation of the siege had nothing to do with weapons. With every man needed for defense, Baden-Powell was short on manpower for jobs like running messages and serving as lookouts. Major Lord Edward Cecil, Baden-Powell's chief of staff, organized the town's young boys into a uniformed corps, the Mafeking Cadet Corps. Dressed in khaki and wide-brimmed hats, these boys, some as young as 11, took on their duties with immense pride. They ran messages between defensive posts, a dangerous job that often exposed them to shellfire. They acted as lookouts, their sharp eyes scanning the Boer lines and sounding the alarm when Creaky was about to fire. At first they used donkeys, but as the food ran out, their trusty mounts ended up in the town's kitchens. For Baden-Powell, the performance of these cadets was a revelation. He saw firsthand how, when given real responsibility, young boys could rise to the occasion with courage and discipline. The experience planted a seed in his mind, an idea about training boys in scouting, observation, and self-reliance. The Mafeking Cadet Corps was the direct inspiration for what would, a few years later, become the global Boy Scout movement. As April turned to May 1900, the siege entered its 7th agonizing month. The defenders were weak from hunger. News had filtered through that a large British relief force was finally fighting its way toward them. For the Boers, time was running out. The man who would lead the final, desperate gamble was a dashing Boer officer named Field Cornet Cyril Elof, grandson of President Kruger. Boasting he would eat breakfast in Mafeking's hotel, he devised a daring plan for a surprise attack, convincing about 240 Boers to join him. In the pre-dawn darkness of May 12th, the attack began. A diversionary fire from the east drew the defenders' attention. Under this cover, Elof and his party crept around to the west, slipping through the lines along the Molopo River and into the Baralong town, the Stadt. They set fire to the huts, a signal of their success that also served as an instant alarm for the entire garrison. Elof's men pushed on, capturing the old police barracks. For a moment, it seemed the end had come. But Baden-Powell reacted swiftly. He ordered his men to close in behind Elof's party, cutting them off. General Snyman failed to press the advantage. The main Boer force never attacked. Cyril Elof and his men were now trapped inside the very town they had come to capture. The fighting raged for hours. Surrounded in the barracks, Elof held out all day, but with no hope of reinforcement, he surrendered. He would have his breakfast in Mafeking after all. As a prisoner of war, dining that night with Baden-Powell, the gamble had failed. The Boers lost around 60 men killed and wounded, with another 108 captured. The defenders had lost 12 dead and 8 wounded. It was the last, convulsive effort of the siege. While Mafeking endured its final struggles, a flying column of about 2,000 picked men was racing across the veldt. Relieving the town had become a matter of national honor for Britain. The empire needed a victory, and Mafeking's dogged defense had captured the public imagination. The commander of the relief force was an Irishman, Colonel Brian Mahon, a hard-driving cavalry officer. His force was a mobile, hard-hitting column designed for speed, made up of elite colonial units like the Imperial Light Horse and a battery of Royal Horse Artillery. Their journey was an epic ride through hostile territory, skillfully evading larger Boer forces. As they drew closer, they linked up with Colonel Plumer's smaller Rhodesian column from the north. On May 16th, the combined force engaged the remnants of the Boer army in a final battle just outside Mafeking. The Boers, demoralized by Elof's failure and the approaching army, put up a brief resistance before melting away. That night, an advance patrol of the Imperial Light Horse finally rode into the town. The siege was over. The relief column officially entered Mafeking on May 17, 1900. The 217-day ordeal had ended. The town's defenders, thin and ragged but unbroken, greeted their rescuers with delirious joy. The celebration in Mafeking was nothing compared to the explosion of joy 6,000 miles away in Britain. When the news reached London on the evening of May 18th, the city went wild. Crowds poured into the streets, singing and cheering. The celebrations were so frenzied that a new word was coined, Mafeking, meaning to celebrate with extravagant public rejoicing. For a nation starved of good news, the relief of Mafeking was a massive psychological boost. It was hailed as a great victory, and Colonel Robert Baden-Powell was instantly transformed into the most famous soldier in the British Empire. The siege became a powerful piece of propaganda, a David versus Goliath story that bolstered support for a war that was proving far more difficult than anyone had expected. The military significance of the siege is debatable. Baden-Powell successfully tied down thousands of Boer troops during a crucial phase of the war. But critics argued that the strategic value of holding the town was minor. But the story of Mafeking was never just about strategy. It was about symbolism. It was the narrative the empire desperately needed. The Siege of Mafeking left an indelible mark on history. The British suffered over 200 killed, while Boer losses were estimated at over 2,000. The uncounted dead from starvation in the Baralong town remain a somber testament to the siege's brutal realities. In the aftermath, Baden-Powell was promoted to Major General and showered with honors. Haunted and inspired by the Mafeking cadets, he hosted an experimental camp on Brownsea Island in 1907, refining his ideas for training boys. From that small camp grew the worldwide Boy Scout movement, arguably the most positive legacy to emerge from the entire conflict. The word Mafeking entered the English language, a synonym for wild celebration. The siege itself became a cornerstone of imperial myth, a heroic tale told for generations, often with uncomfortable details, like the starving of the African population, conveniently scrubbed from the story. Today, the Siege of Mafeking stands as a complex and compelling chapter of history. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare and improvisation. It was a study in leadership, both brilliant and ruthless. It was a tale of incredible endurance and unimaginable suffering. For 217 days, a small town on the edge of the Kalahari became the center of the world, leaving behind a legacy that was part national hero, part global youth movement, and part cautionary tale about the stories we choose to tell about our wars. The Second Boer War is full of these incredible stories of individual battles and sieges that had a huge impact on the wider conflict. What battle or figure from this war do you think we should cover next? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.